Mom left me on my 10th birthday, vanished without a note. Years later, Reddit family Telltales transcribed by Turbo Scribe AI, go unlimited to remove this message. Mom left me on my 10th birthday, vanished without a note. Years later, she came back asking about the $100,000 settlement, so I exposed her in court. Hello everyone, my name is Luca. I am 23 years old and currently living in Bakersfield, California. I own Aunt Patty's Pie, a little bakery where I bake pies every day with the lovely perfume of memories I once tried to forget, but could never truly forget. My story began when I was only 9 years old. Before my parents divorced, I had the life that most children dream about. I grew up in a house full of laughter, movie nights with the entire family, and my mother's soothing hand on my head as I finished schoolwork. But then a storm struck our small household, and everything changed. I used to imagine that after the divorce, Mom would be my safe haven because Dad was no longer present. But deciding to stay with her started a chapter I never dreamed I'd have to go through. A few months later, Mom began seeing a new man, Mason, who I could never accept. He was around a lot, and as a result, Mom Dahlia started coming home late and neglecting me. Every time Mason walked through the door, everything inside me tightened. Couldn't take it. I behaved out by remaining silent at times and talking back at others, which enraged Mom. After witnessing me push back repeatedly, she snapped one day about a month later and exclaimed frustratedly, "Luca, you need to learn to accept this." Hearing those words made my throat clench. I felt like I was losing the only person I could rely on. I had always assumed that Mom would love me no matter what, but I had no idea that her love for me would one day feel more like a duty than anything genuine. 2 months later, on my 10th birthday, I lost her totally. I recall that morning so well. Mom stepped into my room with a modest present box. When she noticed me still laying in bed, she gave me a rare smile and said softly, "Get ready. We're going on a little trip for a few days." My heart rate increased. For a brief moment, a ray of hope appeared within me. This journey may bring us closer again. I hastened to gather my belongings, making sure not to forget my plastic robot, a 9th birthday present from my father, Grant. That afternoon, Mom drove me to a tiny home in Central California. When we arrived, Aunt Patty, my late grandmother's younger sister, greeted us. Aunt Patty looked surprised when we arrived at her door and asked, "Dahlia, why didn't you call first?" Mom smiled and replied, "We're just here to relax for a few days." Luca wanted to experience a little country air. Aunt Patty nodded warmly and agreed. That night, Mom held me while we slept on Aunt Patty's sofa. I could feel the warmth of her arms around me, and at that moment I was convinced she still loved me. I fell asleep in the comfort that I hadn't felt in months when her partner entered her life. What I didn't realize at the time was that it would be the final time I was held by her. When I awoke the next morning, the house was strangely silent. The only sound was the slow, constant whir of the ceiling fan above me, like the heartbeat of a silent house. Seconds later, I sat up, scouring the room for Mom. I dashed into the kitchen, then out to the porch, yelling her name aloud, but there was no response. After about 15 minutes of looking, I returned inside, curled up on the sofa, and clutched my plastic robot, my sole remaining companion. 1 hour passed, then 2. I remained waiting, eyes locked on the door, hoping she had simply stepped out for a moment and would return shortly. As I sat there, petrified with horror, the front door flung open. I leaped to my feet, hoping and praying it was her, but as I saw Aunt Patty enter the living room, my heart fell. There was no trace of my mother. Aunt Patty's voice quivered as she inquired, "Luca, where's your mother?" I froze. A searing agony went throughout my chest. Mom was entirely gone. She hadn't left any note, not even a goodbye. She only left behind the promise of a trip to the countryside, fields and goats. A trip that was never intended to draw us closer, but rather to leave me behind. I never expected that the thing I was so excited about would end up changing my childhood forever. And that's when I discovered the sad truth. My mother had abandoned me on my 10th birthday, and it was the most devastating gift she had ever given. Aunt Patty sat beside me after realizing my mother had left, her eyes filled with concern as she tried to keep her words quiet. She grasped my hand and whispered, "Luca, your mom will come back. Don't worry." Then she hurried to the landline and dialed my mother's number repeatedly, but we just got that unending hollow ring. And I, a 10-year-old kid, had no idea what to do but cry my heart out. The fear was so intense that it felt like it was crushing my small chest. Aunt Patty kindly took me into an embrace after seeing my emotions. Even as she embraced me, I could sense helplessness in her eyes. There we were, Two strangers brought together by a decision neither of us had requested. That first week, I spent every day sitting at the window, eyes locked on the dirt road outside, waiting for Mom to return. Those first few nights at Aunt Patty's, I was tortured by memories. Every time I closed my eyes, I was transported back to the custody hearing in the family court, when Mom was granted complete custody of me. I remembered how Mom and Dad sat silently. There were no disputes or shouting, only a thick, awful silence. I remembered the furious conflicts that had occurred during Dad's few visits home. He was a Marine and was always gone. When he eventually returned, he frequently yelled. In those hazy memories, I could still hear Mom's upset and frustrated voice yelling at him, claiming he never genuinely cared about us. That grief, that rawness still resonated within me. I knew she felt abandoned, lonely, and worn down by his prolonged absence. As I grew older, my comprehension grew deeper. I sensed they were unhappy. Perhaps this is why she couldn't remain with him anymore. But the memories did not stop with the arguments. I also remembered the last time I saw Dad the day he got in the car to return to base. He glanced at me and whispered, "Wait for me, Luca. I'll come back for you." The memory of that promise made my heart ache. I miss him. I miss the farewell hug he gave me in the courts, the look in his eyes that was filled with shame and grief for not being able to stay and keep our little family together. And when I thought about all of that, the tears would flow anew. All I had left was the plastic robot he gave me, a tiny sign of optimism and a recall of a promise I still held on to. I felt trapped in a storm with no way out at the time, and I couldn't help but wonder if Dad's promise would ever be fulfilled. After a week of waiting for Mom and no sign of her return, Aunt Potty and I reluctantly accepted that she was not coming back for me. From that day forward, I lived in Aunt Potty's little house in Central California. It was a strange area for me, with low wooden fences and the incessant clatter of an ancient ceiling fan. Aunt Potty lived alone. She was forthright, and she never veiled her feelings toward children. One afternoon, in a flat, matter-of-fact manner, she looked at me and stated, "I live alone for a reason. I'm not cut out to raise anybody's kid." Hearing those words hit me hard. My heart sank, and I cried profusely that day. I knew I was not welcome. I realized I was nothing but a burden for her, except even when confronted with a withdrawn little boy who did nothing except cry and clutch to a plastic robot, waiting day after day for a mother who would not return. Aunt Potty couldn't ignore me. A few days later, she decided to put her pie business on hold and drive me back to our old house to hunt for Mom. When I found out she was taking me, I felt that flicker of hope come back. I pictured seeing Mom and leaping into her arms, as I used to do after travels with Dad. But when we arrived, the house was completely shut up. Weeds have taken over the yard. The neighbors informed us that she had sold the house and gone away with her lover, leaving no contact information behind. When I heard that, a sudden, excruciating ache surged through my chest. Aunt Potty was enraged when she found my mother had abandoned me and purposefully placed me on her. Without saying anything, she drove me to the Child Services Center. But as we stopped at the front gate, she took my hand and said firmly, "Come on, you're going home with me." That sentence felt like the sun breaking through the darkest storms of my life. I nodded without hesitation, and she led me away through the bustling streets, complaining about being stuck with a kid like me. Honestly, I'm glad Aunt Potty changed her mind. I'm not sure where I would have ended up if she hadn't. After more than 2 weeks of living with Aunt Potty, I gradually adapted to the pace of life in Central California. I still waited for my mother every day, but my hope began to erode. My dreams about her stopped coming every night, and I began to realize that she was not coming back. Though hesitant at first, Aunt Potty gradually began to care for me in her own manner. Perhaps it was a pity for the child who had been left behind. When Mom baked, she would always keep the finest slice for me. Every morning she prepared a basic breakfast and barked, "Shoot, don't start smelling." As for me, the boy who had previously exclusively played with robots and toy cars, I gradually became accustomed to the dirt, grass, and filth of the countryside. Then one little occurrence occurred. Aunt Potty and I went to the market one morning. In her typically caustic tone, she replied, "Stick with me, don't get lost." But as she was picking out flour for baking, I noticed someone who looked like my mother. My heart raced. I raced after the figure, crying, "Mom." I maneuvered through the crowd, calling her name repeatedly, until the woman turned around and I realized it wasn't her. That was the moment I realized I'd lost Aunt Potty. Panic overcame me. I looked about but didn't know where I was. The familiar feeling of being abandoned returned, and my legs began to tremble. Nearly an hour later, I was sitting behind a dumpster behind the market. Aunt Potty had handed me a pastry earlier not to eat, but to hold on to. I simply sat there, frozen. Then unexpectedly, I heard urgent footsteps. I looked up to see Aunt Potty. Her hair was a disaster. She was out of breath and her eyes were filled with concern. She hurried up to me, knelt, and held me hard. Her voice trembled as she said, "Thought I lost you. Though I really lost you." At that moment, I trembled not just from terror, but also from the tremendous emotion of being actually cared for. It was the first time I felt something so intense from her. And in that instant, I realized these two strangers had transformed into something more. We were no longer separated. After nearly a month without hearing from my mother, I noticed Aunt Potty had gotten quieter. There was a worry in her eyes that she never spoke aloud. Then one day, Mom made a life-changing decision. She opted to formally adopt me. When Alma, my next-door neighbor, discovered that my mother had left me at Aunt Pat's, she stepped in to help. She produced the required documentation and gently walked her through the guardianship process. Thanks to Alma, once everything was completed and authorized, I was able to return to school, have regular checkups, and officially become a member of Aunt Pat's modest home. After everything they had done for me, something within me began to thaw. I no longer felt like an abandoned child. My second mother, Aunt Potty, was already in her 60s. She never said, "I love you." But her care, breakfast, and pies provided me with a sense of security that I had believed was lost forever. Alma, who later became my instructor, was always quietly present. Her presence in the school hallways and the way her eyes supported me without saying anything provided solace on the days when I missed my mother the most. She became my anchor, especially as the next storm in my life approached. Potty raised me with all the love she had learned as a first-time mother throughout the 5 years I lived with her. I was a stubborn teenage boy back then, and I occasionally irritated her, but she never slapped me, yelled at me, or threatened to leave. Whenever I apologized, her eyes softened. Then she'd bring me into her loving embrace and hug me like a true mother. I gradually adjusted to life in the rural core of Central California, having grown up in a metropolis with playgrounds and televisions. Potty would accompany me to the town market on weekends, where trays of fresh, fragrant pies were displayed. She taught me how to wrap them, how to meet guests, and most importantly, how to appreciate every dime we made. In the evenings, beneath the dull yellow light, she'd tell me stories about her life, like why she chose to live alone, why she decided to bake, and even give her secret recipe, which she had never shared with anyone before. Her stories sank into me, they made me fall in love with baking, and gradually I began to feel like I belonged there. But then 5 years later, shortly after I turned 15 on a cold winter morning, Potty died softly and gently in her bed. I recall how sharp the cold was that year, as if it was piercing through my skin. But the true pain came from the sudden void she left behind. As I prepared for school that morning, I noticed her familiar brown shoes in the corner of the room. I entered her bedroom and noticed her lying still on the bed. I assumed she was sleeping in due to tiredness. But then, a concept struck me like a punch in the chest. In all those years, she had never slept after 5 a.m. She was constantly getting up and leaving the house before I opened my eyes. Fear gripped me as soon as I realized this. I called her name repeatedly, but she did not answer. I dashed to her side, shaking her and shouting out harder, but she didn't reply. Her face appeared calm, as if she were sleeping soundly. But she was gone forever without a farewell. But the worry I felt then was not simply about losing her. It was based on the news I received after her death. 3 days after Potty was laid to rest, a Child Protective Services worker visited the house. The woman wore a thick coat, held a clipboard, and spoke softly but coldly. "Since there is currently no legal guardian listed, Luca will need to be placed in a youth care facility." When I heard that, it seemed like all the oxygen had been stolen from my lungs. At the time, I was too young to live alone. And under California law, I couldn't stay at Potty's residence without a legal guardian or an active custody order. Even though it was the only place I had ever known as home, my throat clenched as I realized there was nowhere else to turn. Alma was standing next to me when she began to cry. She consented to become my temporary guardian so that I could stay at Potty's house. In the days that followed, I lived alone in the small house Potty had left behind, relying on the modest resources she had accumulated over time. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me motivated to continue baking and keeping her spirit alive. After Grandma died, I began baking in my spare time, utilizing the recipes she left behind to earn a living while keeping her near to my heart. After months of trial and error, I succeeded in recreating her favorite flavor, warm, fragrant apple cinnamon. Alma took a little video of me writing, "I miss you" on one of the pies while I was peacefully baking in the familiar kitchen. She later sent me the video with an encouraging message, and I used it to enter my first baking competition when I was 16. My pie garnered good marks from the judges. And even more unexpectedly, the video went viral online, touching the hearts of many. It was the first stepping stone that led me to a future profession. For a brief time after everything that had occurred, I envisaged a brighter future in which each pie connected me to potty. But I never expected that moment to turn my life upside down again. After more than 2 years of living alone in Potty's little house, I eventually adapted to the sedate, regulated pace she had left behind. Alma's calm support helped me grow up. I learned to care for myself and live frugally with the money I earned from selling pastries at the weekend market. I learned to handle every dime by listening to the oven, as if it were my own life. Then one day in early July, I received a letter from the city of Bakersfield with a notice of reclamation. Potty's home was directly in the line of a planned federal highway expansion. By law, I had 60 days to answer, and if I accepted, I had up to 90 days to depart the premises. The government gave over $100,000 as compensation. When I received the notice, I held the letter for a long time, unsure whether to be delighted or unhappy. If I accepted, I'd get the money but would lose Potty's home. The location I'd called home. The site is full of memories. My mother abandoned me, and this is where I was cherished and cared for. Alma, my temporary guardian, began assisting me with the paperwork to get the money and find a new place to live. We intended to start a separate account, set aside some funds for rent, and save the remainder for the future. However, just a few days after the initiative was publicized on the news, the woman who had previously abandoned me returned. Dahlia, my mother. That day, as I was packing to relocate, my mother unexpectedly appeared at the gate. She stood there in the midday sun, resting against the old wooden fence, her face exhausted, and her eyes red and swollen as if she had just cried. When I stepped out onto the porch, she looked at me, trembling, and whispered, "Luca, it's me. I miss you." The moment I saw her, my entire body froze. Even if my recollections of her had faded with time, her voice and gaze remained imprinted on my consciousness. After all those years of being left behind, I was curious what I would do if she returned. I envisioned her apologizing, crying, or simply stopping over to see me for a bit before departing again. But when it happened, I felt neither happy nor upset. Instead, I felt empty inside. After what she had done to me, I didn't want to believe anything she said, but I didn't want to quarrel either. And part of me hoped that this time, she would try to make things right. Alma was in the hospital after having baby and couldn't help me deal with.